Hello and welcome to Discussability, a podcast focusing on community education and storytelling around disability. We are your hosts, Macdonald Metzger, and
Chilaka.
we create accessible, inclusive content for the general public. Discussion topics include current events in disability, lived experiences, policies, and resources.
Hello, listeners out there in the podcast realm. You are listening to Discussability, the podcast about all things disability inclusion, policy, and storytelling, just to name a few. I am your host, Chilaka.
And I'm your host, Macdonald Metzger. Christine, you recently sat down with researcher and disability advocate, Dr. Lydia Ocasio-Stoutenburg. How was that? How did that go?
Yeah, it was so much fun having the opportunity to talk with Dr. Ocasio-Stoutenburg. We discussed parenthood, diversity, and everything in between.
Well, let's in fact hear how that conversation went.
Hello, listeners. Welcome to the Discussability podcast, where we get you in the know about all things disability. I'm really excited for our guest today, Dr. Lydia Ocasio-Stoutenburg. Lydia Ocasio-Stoutenburg is a researcher and advocate for people with disabilities and their families. She received her dual bachelor's degree of science from Stony Brook University and master's of science in biology from Adelphi University, and a second master's degree in special education at St. Thomas University in 2014. Lydia's advocacy work began in 2010 with a journey of complete personal and professional transformation. Based on test results during her pregnancy with her fifth child, doctors informed her of the increased likelihood of her child would have Trisomy 21 or Down syndrome. When she refused to put her child at risk by undergoing more rigorous testing, the doctors responded with a pessimistic and deficit-based view of carrying a child with a disability to term and poor prognosis for life. She firmly believes in overcoming the deficit-based perspective and by creating stronger communities, raising awareness, and fostering hope. Lydia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And so to kind of start off, can you talk a little bit about why you decided to work in the disability advocacy industry?
Well, what's interesting is, and as you ran off my background, it just seems so far away. I was really one of these hard science folks, really interested in biology. I taught for a few years biology, and so that was kind of my wheelhouse. So now, as a mother of a child with a disability, it really changed my perspective a lot. Not that I don't believe in science, because obviously I'm still a scientist, I'm a social scientist, and I still do greatly value natural science and what we can discover through our inquiries. But what it's changed is my perspective on how we value people. And a lot of our history, our unfortunate medical history, psychology, is rooted in eugenics. And that has been devaluing of people based on their presentation, not seeing people of all presentations as part of our human expression. And that's where we've kind of fallen short. So it really has driven me not only to be this mother, but also to be this scholar, to take it a step further, also to be an activist. And I feel like myself, as a parent, along with other disabled advocates, we learn so much from each other and really support one another in the voices. There are so many allies in this movement who are important. And these are what we call critical voices, because they're allowing us to understand our history, how much we need to change, how much farther we need to go, what progress is. And sometimes these so-called experts are not those who might measure progress and may have different views. But it's important that we work together collectively, again, to make a better world for our families.
Yeah. What are the three main keys to keep in mind when you're advocating for persons with disabilities?
Well, the history of the word advocacy is one who speaks for. And I use that term very loosely because as a mom right now, I'm speaking for my son. Well, now he's getting into his adolescent years.
Oh my gosh.
So I think it's a lot of me speaking with him, and that's important to honor as well. We know that there are a lot of folks who have disabilities who may not be able to express themselves in the same way by using their voice. That doesn't mean they don't have a lot to say. And so it's important that we honor that. And that's what advocacy is. It's really supporting the person's voice, supporting, and I love going back to the person's voice rather than the cause, because I think a lot of times we get caught up in the cause, in the movement, by forgetting the people who it's all about. And that's what's important now, is to always make sure that we are valued, that our children are a part of society as they grow into adulthood, that they have what they need, and that we disrupt so many of the systems and policies and practices that really hold people back. And that's what we need to really continue to strive toward.
This is, while preparing for this interview, I stumbled across this 2021 article on verywellfamily.com. And it spoke about support for parenting children with disabilities. And in the article, there was a quote made by a rehabilitation counselor named Rose Reef. And she said, "Raising a disabled child can feel like running a marathon where the finish line is constantly being moved further away from you. And no one is cheering for you, and no one seems to get what's so hard for you." And so these parents end up feeling isolated, exhausted, and overwhelmed just by day-to-day life. As a parent with a child, of a child with a disability, and as someone who's also heavily involved in disability advocacy, do you agree with that quote?
I would say I get it. I get it, but I also think we have to step a little bit far beyond that. When my son was born, I would say even before I gave birth, I was really looking, and we're talking about 2010, I really searched the internet for anything I could find about Down syndrome. Now, mind you, I knew the science behind it. I was teaching biology. I knew the genetics. But there's a difference between knowing the science, knowing their chromosome. I mean, I understood all that part, and then it being your child. It's a whole different experience. And so you're entering a new world where no one can really navigate you. It's also important to understand, the cultural pressures. We live in a world where, we're moving fast. And so there's so much pressure on us to be perfect, our perfect lives, our efficient lives. And so for a lot of folks who really have those dreams of a perfect life, I understand why, this may be really disappointing. And so I've had to talk to parents who've been in that place too. For myself, I couldn't find stories of hope. And that's probably what was disappointing to me most, is I couldn't find positive stories. I found so many parents just overwhelmed. And I'm not saying I will, but in no means say it's an easy experience. It's not a walk in the park. But it's a matter of perception, really, to say, what would it take to remove some of the barriers we're experiencing? Say, I love my child the way my child is. Love you for who you are. Wouldn't change a thing. Absolutely would not change a thing. But I wish the world were ready. I wish the world, some of the barriers that he experiences, whether they're structural barriers, systemic barriers, social barriers, people's perceptions, like the parent is describing an isolating experience, it completely is. I mean, no one really does get what you're going through. And it is a journey, and it's going to be a lifelong journey. That's one thing I would emphasize, is there really is no end in place. It is a lifelong journey. As long as you have folks to walk with you, who get you, support you, love your family, love your child, love on your child. I think that's something that's we hope to see in every setting we bring our children to, especially as they move on to adulthoods and they're, have their own personality and their own will, and they're not cute little babies anymore, but right, and so they get stubborn and you just have to value their personhood and respect them, and keep meeting the new individual that they become as they grow.
Yeah, just creating their own personality and supporting that and fostering it. I want to go back to something that you said earlier about how sometimes medicine can be rooted or has a history of being rooted in eugenics, and can be difficult to support those that are considered, quote unquote, for the listeners out there, quote unquote, others. And as someone that works in the healthcare field, I really want to discuss that a little more. How is going to different healthcare appointments, with your child? How do you feel supported? Do you feel a partnership with clinicians?
Well, this has been one of the things that's driven me in my work, in my doctoral study, in completing my PhD. I had to make a decision about what I wanted to study, and I was kind of nervous about doing something so close to home, because I was a mother of children with Down syndrome, but it was something I was really passionate about. And so I knew this was something this was my question, this was my research question. And so I just wanted to listen to the stories of parents, especially those birth stories. What was it like? And obviously parents are going to encounter disability at different points, at different markers. Obviously, parents of children with autism, they will happen a little bit later on. But there are parents who encounter disability from birth with their children. And Down syndrome is one of those experiences. It was a negative experience. And I always tell our emerging leaders to remember that parents are going to remember what you say. Even if you spend 15 minutes with that caregiver, they're going to remember everything you say. So make sure that what you say is impactful, it's positive, and it's going to set them on a path where they feel good. They feel empowered. I'm not saying to paint, roses and rainbows, but also don't set them on a path where they feel as if there's no hope. I myself had an experience that was negative. And, my OB really told me that I was making a tremendous mistake and that my child would be a burden to society.
Wow.
That he would probably never walk, or he'd probably never talk. This would be the end of our marriage. This would be the end of my family. And so I listened to all these things. And again, knowing the science of it and knowing the social experience of it are two different things. And culturally, I'm brought up to, you trust the medical professional. I mean, this is the expert. But again, it's so important to understand how many professionals, many healthcare professionals, even many school professionals, hold on to these very archaic views, these very eugenic, deficit-frame views. Very important to understand how disability was seen as a pathology. It's seen as a sickness, as an illness. And that echoes in our encounters today. And that's why you see so many parents of children with Down syndrome said, my provider was encouraging me to terminate. And that would be unheard of, ethically. But it happens. It's a reality. And again, it's because these views are so pervasive in our systems. And this is what we mean about advocating at the systems level. How do we disrupt those practices so that parents and families don't have to experience that? Imagine robbing families of a positive, welcoming experience of their new baby. And these negative encounters, are what shape their first experiences of pregnancy and their newborn experience. And so that's kind of been my mission too, is trying to do what I can in my part to disrupt those experiences and support families from the very beginning, while also encouraging school professionals and anyone else they encounter to say, your parents are coming in with a history, and you need to honor that. And again, make sure that you're a soft landing place for them.
Yeah, that is just, I can't even begin to even talk about that. To hear that someone who has, and you start to think about like power dynamics and to have someone at a level where, you're entrusted with caring, for people. It's just, to say something like that is just really appalling, to be just frank with you. I think that when you talk about culture, and a lot of different identities really impact a lot of these views, very archaic views, that not only health professionals can have, but society, as a society in general. And we talked about all these different roles and hats that you wear, but you're also an author, and you have a book called Meeting Families Where They Are: Building Equity Through Advocacy with Diverse Schools and Communities. And in this book, you talk about disability advocacy and how it intersects with racism, ableism, and classism. What impact does this intersectionality have on communities of color, especially when you bring in disability?
I know that the word intersectionality has really been co-opted so often now. But I really take it back to Kimberly Crenshaw, talking about how there are folks with identities that have been really multiply marginalized, and that oppression is really magnified at the intersection. And she specifically spoke about Black women, and what that experience is like. And it's important to take it back to those origins, to understand really the hegemony of race and racism, I should say. Through my studies with families and writing this book, you, as a researcher, as a qualitative researcher, you go in with, your lens. Obviously, as a qualitative researcher, you go in with your positionality, and where you are in proximity to your participants. And I know my own identity as a Black woman, and as a mother of a child with a disability, as a mother of a Black boy with a disability, a Black boy with Down syndrome. But I understood that there was an ability for me to understand certain experiences, certain nuances that are very important. And advocacy is not advocacy, is not advocacy. To understand the power and privilege that some families have that others do not. Why? It is the magnification of oppression and othering by race and disability together. Collective, it's a confluence. It's not one and separate the other. It's not like, you see a family and you're like, oh, okay, I'm gonna look at your ethnic identity today and how you're presenting to me. I'm not gonna look at disability. It's together.
Right.
And to look at those experiences, and you can hear it. You can hear how even some families, in one of our studies, one of our parents was identified as white, and she said she was very privileged, and she acknowledged her privileges. She said, if I had a different identity, I know my experience would have been totally different. My practitioner listened to me, supported me, and valued me. Anything that I wanted to do, I felt that support. And it was important to include that voice for her understanding her position and her power in society that, again, makes judgments. And I'm not just talking about subjective judgments. I'm talking about judgments that translate into services, that translate into supports, that are going to have lifelong impacts. Those are important. So I know we speak a lot about implicit bias, but these really manifest in some really serious outcomes. This is something that we really need to address. We need to confront intersectionality, not to talk about it as a thing. It shouldn't just be a group think, but it should be a part of our actions, to try and see what can we do to really support those families. And this is where we got the title, Meeting Families Where They Are. Not telling families, hey, you need to act, speak, think like this. allowing them to understand, listen, this is a very bureaucratic process. Everything is very technical. You may or may not understand the language that's being used. How can we share power with families? That's our ideal. How can we, those who have more power and privilege, be willing to give up some of that in order to, again, that's what equity is. It's not, hey, everyone has an equal share, but how do we, again, make sure that we're disrupting the experiences that they have had, again, historically and presently, again, by sharing power.
Do you think it's important to recognize disability as diversity?
I think it's very important to understand disability as diversity. I think it's important to understand disability as contributing to our human experience. I think it's important to really disrupt that narrative about, this is other, this is different than. And there are a lot of folks who will say that differently. I myself, working with many self-advocates, they challenge me and say, hey, I don't want to use that word. And I say, okay, whatever word people prefer, you have to honor their preferences. You really do. And I'm learning that as I go on and as I meet different people. But it's important to celebrate that as part of our range of human expression, and say disability is part of the range of human expression. My son, who's 12, is one of my 5 children. He contributes to our family, just like everyone else contributes to our family. He has his own personality. He has his own wants, needs, preferences, good qualities, challenging qualities. The same as the rest of the members of our family. And so I think that membership is really important.
Yes.
To really value the membership in our human community, our human family. And that's something that really has not been there historically.
Yeah.
But it's something, again, we need to constantly work on.
And I will say, as a child of 5, 5 is a fantastic number.
I think it is.
Yeah, and you're talking about having a son and his upcoming teens. I guess it's called preteens or tweens. But what are some of the resources that you felt were and still are vital in supporting you in the past while you were raising your children, and specifically your child with Down syndrome, and continues to support you as well?
I really want to emphasize the word community. I can't say community enough. Whoever your community is, find your people. And your people may be other families of children with Down syndrome. You may find that there are things that you have in common. You may find there are things you don't have in common. I have things in common with families of children with autism, because my son does have features that really correspond with autism sometimes. And so there are things that we find that we have in common. And children who don't have a disability at all, there are things that we have in common. It's so important to find where your communities are and really know where you feel welcome, where you feel belong. Your children will let you know too. When they feel comfortable, you will see them comfortable. When they tell you, hey, I don't like it, I want to leave, believe them. Because there are things that they pick up about, it may be people's attitudes, it may be the way people are responding to them. These are things that you really need to recognize. And also understanding your social world. Again, I mentioned this before, that my son is a Black boy with Down syndrome. I know as he gets older and he's in place and space, I'm not sure what someone's perception of him is going to be. Because this is the social world we live in, where, again, these things are happening in our society that we can't ignore. And this is why intersectionality matters. So it's important to find communities where you feel a sense of belonging, where you feel safe, where you have a network of people who are going to work with you, support you. Find who they are. And it's important to again, come out of that isolation, even though that is the inertia to fall back into, well, you know what? It's just us and our family. We're the only people we can understand. Push back on that.
Yeah.
Push back on that. Find your network of folks. They're out there. I promise you they're out there.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about education. In your opinion, what does the educational system get right when it comes to special education?
Well, I'm grateful for the field of special education, because special education is the outcome of great advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
Schools were closed. And just like when we think about Brown versus Board of Education, 1954 schools were closed. Children of color, children were excluded from schooling. Children with disabilities were excluded from schooling. They could tell them, no, you won't have been. And this is really important, that the parent advocates followed the civil rights movement, saw that it was successful, used the same sort of strategies, and said, let's fight for this under the 14th Amendment. Okay, that's where we have the field of special education and the laws. So now protection under the law is really important, because it's going to codify that your children have the right to receive a free and public education, right? And all the other stipulations that are there. It's very important to have that in the law. Does that mean that the law is always exercised? Does that mean that there are not practitioners in the educational system and administrators who are merely compliant with the law, or compliant with the law on paper, but not really doing so in practice? Does that mean that our educational spaces are not doing harm to our children?
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's important to not look at this as we've won.
Yeah.
It's a victory. We're finished. There's still a tremendous amount of work to do. So at the very minimum, it's great that we have the ability for our children to be educated in a public school setting. That's important to have that legislation. If we had implementation with fidelity in all of our practices, that's what we need to work toward. And creating, and I'm going to bring back that word again, community.
Mm-hmm.
Creating communities within the school where children are have that sense of belonging, have that sense of school citizenship, are integrated with their peers, are loved and valued as much in the classroom as they are outside of the classroom. Again, it's still a work in progress, but there are some things that we can say we do get right in terms of acknowledging that our children can get services and supports that they need. Again, because of that legislation, because of the actions of advocates who wanted to see better for their children, we have that. So that is something to say, yes, it's not a perfect system, in no means, by no means, but we do have some things in place that we can work with.
And, before we run out of time here, there were a few more questions I wanted to ask you. You were part of an organization that we in the discussability realm know and love, AUCD. How did you get involved in that, and what was your role?
So many years ago, when I was a part of an emerging leaders program, I found out about AUCD. And again, this is part of finding your community. So family community, neighborhood community, local community, state community, but now we're talking about national community. So then now to find that there are folks all over, right? Families all over, families, self-advocates, doctors, trainees, therapists, all kinds of folks who are involved, again, in supporting and advocating for the lives of people with disabilities and their families. It is an entire network. And so many years ago, I said, one day I'd love to be involved. I'd love to be involved on that level. And so happened that, in my employment, I worked at a university Center for Excellence on Developmental Disabilities, and got involved that way. Again, this part of advocating for yourself and your voice, and felt that I could contribute my own voice as well as a mother, and also as a woman of color. So looking at all those lenses, I'm able to contribute some of my own perspectives, and it's useful to have, again, a range of people from all different geographical areas and lived experiences, and again, bringing their expertise to the table in a very meaningful way. So really value my ability to, again, be part of AUCD network, to have chaired the Multicultural Council, and to be a part of the AUCD Board of Directors. It's something that I value very much.
And I love how you keep bringing back in community and how vital it is, just to build something around you that can help lift you up and provide that support. And, my final question, and this is one question that I love to ask my guest, what is something that you wish we talked about?
I wish we spoke more about love. I know that's, something we don't often talk about in these spaces, but I wish we spoke more from a love framework. And scholar Bell Hooks talked a lot about love being really the center from which all of our actions should radiate from. That love, right? Love is so powerful, right? It's generative. It's also cohesive, right? That brings us together, it binds us together. But if we're not leading from love as a central point in serving our families and serving our children, in identifying what would support families best, just thinking about how love could lead all of our actions. Love is leading to valuing people for who they are and seeing them as part of the human expression, right? Yeah, our range of humanity. Everything should radiate from there. How we work together as colleagues, supporting and uplifting each other's work, uplifting voices that we don't hear from, people who are marginalized, trying to say, what can we do to disrupt that? What can we do to bring people into the fold, to bring people into community? I think love is such a leading and guiding force. And I wish we spoke more about that when we talk about people with disabilities and their families. If we could lead more from love, I think it would change so much.
Dropping my mic, Dr. Lydia Ocasio-Stoutenburg. That was a powerful ending to such a great interview. Thank you so much for joining us and finding the time to speak with us today. We've got a scholar, educator, parent, advocate, author. It's really been an honor.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, is there anything that you would like our viewers to know? Books, Twitter page, any way to get in contact with you if they want to ask more questions?
Our books are available on Teachers College Press, Meeting Families Where They Are, and also have a case study book that's a companion to that book. You can follow me on Twitter at Lydia Ocasio-S, and that's it. I just look forward to being in community with you all and continuing to learn and grow together and celebrating our families. I mean, I think that's number one.
Perfect.
And thank you, Christine, for the work that you're doing.
Absolutely. I just provide a platform. So I'm really grateful to all of my guests that find the time to come on. Well, there you have it, folks, in the disability realm. Dr. Lydia Ocasio-Stoutenburg. And please, if you have any questions, reach out to us on Twitter at Discussability Podcast, or reach us on Google, Gmail, discussabilitypodcast@gmail.com. All right, viewers. Well, until next time, this is Christine Chilaka, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you to our guest for this show. We will be back with another episode next month. But in the meantime, we want to know, what would you like to discuss this season? Write to us at the email address discussability@gmail.com. That's DISCUSSABILITY@gmail.com, or leave us a voicemail at 701-888-9224. Again, that's 701-888-9224.
This has been an episode of Discussability, the podcast that gets you in the know about all things disability. You can also find us on Twitter at Discussability and on YouTube. Discussability is produced by Christine Chilaka, Gregory Friedberg, Kenneth Pechtl, and Macdonald Metzger. You can find Discussability on iTunes, Google, Spotify, and wherever podcasts are made available. Music is Around the Bend by Evan Schaefer, used with permission. Thank you for joining us.